Folks, I got to tell you, this is a message that I have wanted to preach for years. So buckle up, buttercups. We're going to turn to a text in the Bible that I have annoyed all of my pastoral colleagues to death about. I have constantly talked about this text because it just fascinates me. It just leaves me with questions and thoughts and reflections that I can't get away from. So today is the day we're going to get to that text, and I'm going to lay it out there for you as best I can because this story absolutely fascinates me. But before we get to that text, a little bit of background. We need to spend a few minutes thinking through, where did my notes go? This is going to get dangerous without my notes. Here we go. Need to give you a little bit of background. The larger story behind this text is a story of three men who worked together to spread the hope of the gospel across the northeastern quadrant of the Mediterranean basin. The first of these men was a man that is sometimes called by his Jewish name, John, and other times by his Roman name, Mark. Most consistently, the New Testament calls him both John Mark, so that's what we're going to call him today. It's possible that the first time we meet John Mark is in the story about the Garden of Gethsemane. In one of the Gospels, you'll remember that as the mob tried to take Jesus captive, all of Jesus' disciples ran away in fear. And one particular young man was wearing, it seems, only a towel. And he barely escaped with the towel hanging from the fingers of his assailants. And so he ran away naked into the darkness surrounding the garden. The text doesn't tell us for sure who this is, but a lot of readers, a lot of historians and such believe that that was indeed John Mark. The next time we see John Mark is he shows up in Acts chapter 12 in the episode around AD 44 when Peter escaped from prison. It's one of the miracles in the book of Acts when an angel came and literally helped Peter escape from prison. Peter finds refuge in the home of Mary, who was John Mark's mother. They tell us that a large crowd was gathered in that house, meaning it was a fairly big house, meaning that Mary and John Mark's family was a rather wealthy family. John Mark's father is never mentioned here. We don't know if he had a father that was still alive. We just don't know. But later in life, Peter referred to John Mark as my son in the faith. So clearly there was a close relationship between John Mark and one of the original 12 disciples. The next time we see John Mark, he is traveling with two of his mission companions, one of whom was his cousin, a man named Joseph. Joseph was John Mark's cousin. Joseph was a Levite, a Jewish believer from the nation island of Cyprus, and he was one of the original members of the church in Jerusalem. Joseph was an incredibly generous man. The testimony about him in the New Testament was that he gave the proceeds from the sale of a plot of land and just donated to the church and said, y'all use it however you need to. He had a positive reputation as a man, a good man, a man full of the Holy Spirit, a man full of faith. Everywhere Joseph went, people came to know Christ and people were strengthened in their faith. You and I know Joseph by a more familiar name, Barnabas, the son of encouragement. So now we've got two of our guys. We've got John Mark and Barnabas. Barnabas, one of his most significant contributions to the cause of Christ was his relationship to the third man in our story. And we know this third man very well, the Apostle Paul. But before Paul, Paul was Saul. And that's how we know him at this point in the story. Saul was a Pharisee. Saul was a Jewish leader. He was a member of the Jewish elites there in Jerusalem, one of the most influential classes in their culture, in their society. But Saul, was known for his notorious hatred of Christians. He was a persecutor of that fledgling church, and he was known to seek out, to use spies to find Christians hiding out in Jewish communities and have them arrested and thrown in jail. And there's even an episode where a Christian gets murdered by a mob, and Saul is present and agrees to it. thinking that it's a good thing. This is Saul, whose mission is to stamp out Christianity. There's an episode in Saul's life where he is going to set out to Damascus, which is up in Syria. And if you look at a map, there's a long road between Jerusalem and Damascus. It's a long way away. And yet Saul, I'm going to call him Paul forever. Y'all forgive me. Right now, every time I say Paul, just replace it with Saul, because he's not Paul yet. He's Saul right now. Saul gets word that there are Christians in Damascus that need to be arrested, that need to be taken into custody. So he starts making his way there. And on the road to Damascus, he meets Jesus in a supernatural vision that leaves him struck blind and unable to eat or drink. The people that are with him, they can hear the voice that Paul is hearing, Saul is hearing. Golly, Pete, I'm so irritated with myself. You want me to start over? I'll just start over. I'm kidding. They could hear what Saul was hearing, but they couldn't see what he was hearing. But they knew something really bizarre, something really unusual had happened. So they took Paul by the hand and they led him into Damascus, where they put him in a room and then just kind of wondered what to do next. In Damascus, there was a strong Christian community. One of those believers was a man named Ananias. Ananias received a vision from God, and in the vision, God said, Ananias, I want you to go to pray for and lay hands on this man, Saul of Tarsus, so that he might be healed and receive his sight back. Ananias replied to God, and Greek scholars will tell you it says something like, you gotta be kidding. Because the Christians there, they knew what Saul was up to. They knew his mission, that he was coming to arrest them. They fully believed that Saul was their enemy. But Ananias agreed to go. Ananias did as God asked. Ananias prayed for him, laid hands on him. And the story says that scales, or something like scales, fell off Paul's eyes and he could see again, and he began to regain his strength. Well, Saul, as we know, was absolutely zealous in his persecution of Christians. So now we can expect him to be zealous in his relationship with Jesus. And that's exactly what he was. He began to preach Jesus in the synagogues of Damascus. And all of the Jewish people there were really confused because they knew that he was a Pharisee. They knew that he was on this mission to stamp out Christianity, that he was considered an enemy of Christians, and they just didn't know what was going on. But they became so concerned that they decided they needed to kill him. So they started to plot to capture him and put him to death. His Christian friends helped him escape under the cover of darkness, and Saul went back to Jerusalem, which was home. Except in Jerusalem, he tried to get acquainted with the body of Christ, the Christian community there, and they were suspicious. They were afraid of him. They thought that it was some kind of a ruse, a trick for him to learn who all the different Christians were so that he could arrest them too. But this brings us to one of Barnabas' really big, important moments. Barnabas takes Saul to meet with the core leadership team there in Jerusalem. Peter, James, and John, the sort of big three who were a part of the original 12. And Barnabas told them about everything that he knew, that he had seen, that he had heard about Saul, about his conversion, about Saul's preaching in Damascus. And so it seems that there was at least some degree of acceptance between that leadership team, Peter, James, and John, and Saul. They began to kind of feel this out and be okay with it. And Saul, meantime, he's like, you know what? Now I'm Jerusalem. I'm going to go preach Jesus here too. So he starts going all across Jerusalem preaching Jesus. And he winds up in contention with a group called the Hellenists. The Hellenists were Greek-speaking Jews who had a very different cultural worldview from the regular Hebrew Jewish folks. And so he wound up in arguments with them because he was one of the former, and they decided they wanted to kill him too. There seems to be a pattern developing here with Paul. It's always a matter of life or death, it seems. The Christians in Jerusalem once again stepped in and helped Saul, to get away, and he made his way up to his hometown, Tarsus in Cilicia. Okay, I've thrown a lot of stuff at you. I'm going to throw some more. Do we have any questions to this point? All right. Meanwhile, while Saul is chilling out in hometown of Tarsus, and in Antioch, Syria, a revival of sorts break out. And so the council in Jerusalem sends Barnabas to Antioch to see what's going on, to check it out, just to understand what's happening, because as far as the Christians in Jerusalem knew, they really did feel like they were the center of what God was doing in the world, and they didn't really understand yet how the message of the gospel was reaching out to Gentile communities. So they simply sent Barnabas to go and take a look and see what's going on. So Barnabas leaves Jerusalem, goes to Antioch. While he's in Antioch, he hears that Saul is in Tarsus. So he goes to Tarsus, gets Saul, and brings him back to Damascus. Now this matters because Barnabas and Saul spent about a year in Antioch preaching and teaching. And it was in Antioch that you and I, followers of Jesus, along with those ancient brothers and sisters, were first called Christians. That's the first time that word came into usage. It's the first time it appears in the scripture. When famine struck the region, the church in Antioch collected food supplies to send to the church in Jerusalem. Saul, forget it. We're just going to call him Paul. Paul and Barnabas travel all the way down from Antioch to Jerusalem. They're in charge of the food delivery. They get John Mark and take him back to Antioch. The band is now finally together. That's why I've told you all of these stories. I want you to understand what led these three men to be in partnership together. The Apostle Paul, at this point called Saul, because his mission had not fully come to flower yet. Saul, Joseph, also called Barnabas, the son of encouragement, and John Mark, cousin of Barnabas. These three men form a team. And after a few months of staying there and being in ministry, the church in Antioch sends them out on a missionary trip to Cyprus and beyond. It's Paul and Barnabas are the main teachers. John Mark is their assistant. Now, this is about the year AD 44 or so. All of this is unfolding fairly quickly. And the missionary journey went on for several years. And this is the point at which Saul becomes known as Paul. Saul is his Jewish name. Paul is his Roman name. And from here on out, we simply call him Paul. And you don't have to hear me mix it up anymore. After a successful season of ministry in Cyprus, the team sails on to Pamphylia. But when they arrive at Pamphylia, John Mark leaves them and goes back to Jerusalem. And we don't know why. We don't know the reasons. We are never told. But we do know for sure that Paul was very, very much unhappy with young John Mark, that Paul was very disappointed in his decision. This is where we start to get to the text I really, really want to talk about. Some years later, after that missionary trip had concluded, we're around the year 50, Paul suggests that he and Barnabas go visit all those churches again that they went to see those years before. And Barnabas agrees to go, and Barnabas wants to bring John Mark. And Paul says no. And that's where the trouble started. And that brings us to the text that has absolutely fascinated me for years. This is Acts 15, 36 to 41. After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Come, let us return and visit the brothers and sisters in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are doing." Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark, but Paul decided not to take with them one who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not accompanied them in the work. This disagreement became so sharp that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and set out, the brothers and sisters commending him to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Now, folks, I may be the only person on earth that finds this text as fascinating as I do. It's entirely possible that you may leave here today going, gee, I don't know what all that was about. That might happen. So I'm sorry if it does. But I want to tell you why that this story gets my attention. Here you have two giants of faith in Christian history. Paul and Barnabas were responsible for planting a multitude of churches in areas where there had been no churches. There had been Christians still attending synagogues, but they were sort of welcome, not welcome in those contexts. There weren't churches where Paul and Barnabas went until Paul and Barnabas showed up and gathered Christian communities, not only of those who were already Christian, but primarily of those who weren't yet. They came to faith because of Paul and Barnabas' teaching. These two men were radically devoted followers of Jesus. These were the cream of the crop. And yet, they had one disagreement that sent them down different roads. And here's the question that vexes me. Which one was right? Which one was right? I mean, in one corner, you've got the Apostle Paul, the redeemed persecutor of the church. The man whose conversion experience was so profound that it struck him blind and left him unable to eat or drink for days. And this is not just Paul, run-of-the-mill member of the church, just every man, every kind of person, follower of Jesus. This is Paul the apostle, one who was picked out by name and sent by Jesus. That's what the word apostle means, is one who was sent. That's who this guy is, the one that God would send on a world-changing, history-altering mission. That's Paul in one corner. And in the other corner, you have Barnabas, the guy that built a bridge between Paul and the original Christian community, the guy that got Paul connected with kind of the mother church, the original 12 disciples, the other apostles. They had walked with Jesus face to face. Paul met Jesus years later in a supernatural vision. But that community wanted nothing to do with Paul. They were afraid of Paul until Barnabas vouched for him. Barnabas, too, had a profound ministry of people coming to faith, of believers being encouraged. So both of these men are godly. Both of these men are righteous. Both of these are men of faith. Both of these are men who are fruitful in difficult and challenging missionary endeavors, and they get into a fight. Which one was right? Which one of those two men, in their different opinions, understood accurately the nature of who John Mark was and is, and what the possibilities were and were not? Which one of them was right? See, when I heard the call to pastor, I made certain assumptions about things that I was going to spend the next several years of my life doing. I knew that there was going to be lots of Bible stuff. There's going to be preaching, there's going to be teaching, there's going to be studying and reading. I knew that there were going to be meetings, and sometimes meetings about meetings. I knew that there was going to be things like visiting people in the hospital and being a part of grieving with a family during a funeral and maybe doing a few weddings. I knew there was going to be all that kind of stuff, but nobody ever told me that I'm going to get to be a referee, that I'm going to get to stand in the middle of people having a disagreement, and I was going to have to help folks navigate to find a way to come together. I didn't know that was coming, but I will tell you this. Of all the disagreements that I've witnessed, and all the disagreements that I've been a party to, I've never seen somebody sit there and participate energetically in a disagreement without being fully convinced that they were right. Never. I've never heard somebody say, you know what? I'm tragically mistaken. But here we go. Let's have at it. I've never seen that happen. Anybody that gets into an energetic, vigorous disagreement is convinced that not only are they there, but divine appointment, but God and all the angels of heaven are on their side. I don't care if you're fighting about where the ketchup goes in the kitchen, or if you're fighting about what flavored donuts we have to have at the bar, or if you're fighting about the name of the church or anything else. Every time there's a disagreement, all parties are convinced that their way is the only way. And yet, if you have two people that see something in direct opposition, at least one of them has to be wrong. Now, we could get all philosophical and say, well, yeah, they both could be wrong, but they can't both be right. But I don't want to get that complicated. I want to know which of these two guys was right. I mean, you've got Paul, who was speaking from the perspective of accountability, of duty, of responsibility, of doing the right thing and doing the right thing the right way. Surely Paul's got to be right about that. I mean, look at what John Mark did. John Mark betrayed his teammates. He let them down. He abandoned them midstream. He left them short-handed. He screwed up. And we don't know why. We might have a different opinion than Paul if we knew the reason, but Paul didn't see it as a good reason, whatever it was. Paul decided that John Mark was now disqualified because of his failure. And besides, who wants to live in a world without accountability? I mean, yeah, I know some people might say we already do, but that's neither here nor there. Do we really want a world in which accountability doesn't count? Do we really want a world where there's not such a thing as responsibility? And then there's consequences for being irresponsible? Do we really want that kind of a world? So surely we got to go with Paul, don't we? But Barnabas, on the other hand, he's speaking about redemption. He's from the perspective of forgiveness, of mercy, of second chances. And yes, John Mark was Barnabas' cousin. There's that family connection. But I think it goes deeper than that. I see in Barnabas a pattern of offering people second chances. It was Barnabas who offered Paul a second chance. It was Barnabas who convinced the Jerusalem church, give him the benefit of a doubt. Open your eyes and see the possibilities of this man. It was Barnabas that took the perspective of forgiveness for Paul. So surely you got to kind of lean toward Barnabas, don't you? Which one was right? Paul and his accountability, or Barnabas with his forgiveness? I don't know. I know I've needed to be forgiven before. I'm positive I will be again. I'm willing to bet that's true of you too. We all need a second chance, but yet we all have the potential to mess things up for everybody else if we're irresponsible, if we fail. So which one of these men was right? I really would like to know. What if in God's way of doing things, they both were right? What if God was using Paul and his voice of accountability to help John Mark learn something that John Mark needed to learn? Maybe John Mark needed to learn that it matters when you let your people down. Maybe John Mark needed to learn that there are consequences for choosing to fail. I mean, sometimes we fail because things just happen that we didn't foresee, but sometimes failure is what we choose. Maybe John Mark needed to face the fact that it hurts people, that it creates problems for others when we don't carry our weight, when we don't hold our duty as a sacred responsibility. But I'm sure that John Mark also needed to know that there is such a thing as forgiveness. that there's mercy available when we blow it, that there is a second chance that can be offered so that we can try again. Is that not also something that John Mark needed to hear? Maybe we need both the voice of Paul and accountability and the voice of Barnabas and second chances and forgiveness. It was one of our church members and a member of our leadership board, Chris Tiller. Tiller's, you here today? Well, y'all can tell him I said something positive about him for a change. He was the one that put this idea in front of me, so I can't claim this idea as my own, but once he said it to me, it was one of those, well, duh, kind of moments. Tiller said that in the division between Paul and Barnabas, God's mission was multiplied. That whereas there had been one missionary endeavor moving in one direction, that now there were two missionary endeavors moving in different directions. The mission was wider. The word was going farther with two teams instead of just one. A moment of anger in God's redemptive power fueled an expanded outreach that continued the work, that expanded the work. I think that's a worthy way to see how God was using both accountability and forgiveness to make a difference. But there's other evidence that God was at work in this dispute. First, John Mark was willing to try again. He was willing to go again. I'm reading between the lines here, and it's dangerous to do that with a text like this. It's dangerous to psychoanalyze the players and think you know what was in their hearts and minds. But I do imagine that John Mark looked back at that departure from Pamphylia when he ran back home, possibly with some regret, with a feeling of guilt. I know when I look back at my own failures, I don't like those memories. They make me flinch. They make me twitch a little bit because I still remember them with a pang of embarrassment about the ways that I failed, about the problems I created, about the pain or disappointments that I caused for other people. I don't like thinking about those things. I can only imagine that John Mark did as well. But it also had to be true that he had heard from Paul and Barnabas and the other teammates about the incredible difficulties that they faced during the first missionary trip, about the imprisonments and the nights without sleep and the days without food and running out of cities for the fear of their life. It was not an easy time for Paul and Barnabas and those who continued the mission trip. John Mark had to have heard about that, and yet John Mark was willing to go again. John Mark was different. Whereas he had been someone who ran back home, he's now someone who wants to give it another shot. He's changed. He's grown. He's a different person now than he was back then. Second, Paul and John Mark eventually reconciled. Later in life, Paul referred to John Mark as a fellow laborer who was a comfort to him. Paul didn't talk about many people that way, and yet he spoke that way about John Mark. When Paul was under house arrest in Rome, it was John Mark that came to stay with Paul as a companion and as a co-worker, to be, in a sense, Paul's postman. Paul could write letters, he could receive letters, but he couldn't leave his house because he was under the guard of a Roman soldier to make sure that he didn't. But John Mark could freely come and go, and so John Mark would deliver Paul's letters to other churches and other Christians. And John Mark would bring letters back to Paul so that Paul could stay in connection with the churches that he loved so much. John Mark had become a trusted friend and a valuable colleague. He had earned Paul's confidence. After that first missionary journey, Paul had declared that John Mark was useless. But years later, as Paul came to the end of his life, he considered John Mark to be useful, to be fruitful, to even be essential as a friend and as a partner. But third and most importantly, John Mark left a legacy that passed down through generations and generations of Christians from that moment on to as long as the world is here. You remember the episode from the Garden of Eden about the angry mob and the towel and the naked guy running off into the trees? Well, the text doesn't tell us who that is. But the story appears in only one gospel. The first gospel in our Bible ever written, chronologically speaking. The gospel that bears the Roman half of John Mark's name, Mark. That story about the young man fleeing naked only appears in the Gospel of Mark. It's a weird and awkward story to put in such a somber moment as Jesus is being dragged away by a violent mob, which will lead to his imprisonment and execution. And yet, the gospel writer includes that little statement. What other reason could it be in the story except to say, I was there. I saw what Jesus did. I heard what Jesus said. I was a part of those who walked with him closely. And so that statement gives him credibility as the writer of that version of the gospel story. And we know for sure that Matthew and Luke referred to Mark when writing their own tellings of the gospel. The ancient church fathers uniformly believed that the Gospel of Mark was written by this John Mark. Scholars and historians today vary in their opinions, but I believe that it was written by this John Mark because that seems exactly the kind of thing that God would do. That God would take someone once declared, once labeled useless, failure, let down, disappointment, that God would take someone like that and entrust them with passing the precious, treasured story of Jesus for all future generations. How can it be anybody else but this John Mark that wrote that gospel? John Mark is hardly the first person that God ever used in the grand sweep of salvation that someone else considered unqualified. And thankfully, it wasn't the last.